got my machine all cleaned and ready to go. And then put a new needle in your machine. That will help your life be a lot easier. So we're going to tonight be doing block 12 of the Blockbuster series, and it is called Double Trek. So are we not seeing us? We are seeing us? Okay. So hopefully it will reset. Right now it's as if it just now came on a minute late, so I'm not sure exactly how that worked. So welcome. We are doing block 12, the double trek block, and I have a couple of things to share with you about that. First of all, double trek is one of the blocks that includes a technique that we're going to be doing using the technique sheets. So I wanted to remind you about the technique sheets. First of all, this is my stack of technique sheets. There are multiple technique sheets available, and we have them all here at the shop. They will have on them a little icon at the top that shows you what tool that technique sheet goes with. There's also some little stars there. That's your level of difficulty indicator. Don't let that scare you. If it's a 5-star and it's a technique you want to try, jump in. There's also a good YouTube tutorial for every technique, so you can sit down with your sheet, watch the video, and Deb walks you through the process of how that technique is done. Now, I'm actually going to show you the technique for Sliver tonight as a part of the double trek block. So the technique sheets are all available from us, so make sure that if you don't have the Sliver, you may want to get that so you can make this in several different sizes. So the block for tonight looks like this, and that's a 12-inch block. That on my sample, I made a mistake, and I'll tell you what the mistake was in a little bit, and I'll make sure that you have the right information so you don't make that same mistake. I also wanted to show you something you could do with the double trek block. Instead of making the 9-patch with 4-inch units, that's what this one has. Those are all 4-inch finished units. You can make this with 2-inch finished units, put 4 of them together. And this is a picture of one we did several years ago. And we have 4 complete double trek units, and they make a circle. And if you did a bunch of these, it makes an interesting secondary pattern. For the 12-inch block that we're doing today, we're only doing 4-inch units. We're going to talk about what it takes to make this block. And you, of course, can use any color you want to. Now, I've got plain squares for the corners and a plain square for the center. So I'm just going to lay those aside. I don't need those for what I'm going to show you. And you, of course, can use whatever colors you want to play with. We're going to be making a couple regular corner beam units. Now, if you haven't used the corner beam tool before, or it's been a while and you need a little bit of a refresher, I'm going to talk a little bit about what lines you look for, how you know what parts you need. Let me grab my clipboard that has a white sheet on it so you can see the lines on my tool. Now, I have actually used a Sharpie marker and highlighted some of the lines on my tool, so that I can quickly find those lines as I'm using them. So one thing that you'll need to know is that using our corner beam tool, we're going to cut the pieces for our corner beam unit using this angled side of our tool. So this center beam is cut from a square. I'll grab my square and show you how that works. So I have 2 red squares, and of course you could make yours whatever color you wanted to. And then my side triangles are also cut with this side angle, but they're cut from a strip. And I've got a strip of my background fabric, and I actually have kept it folded, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The other thing that this side of the tool gives you is sizing information. So I know this needs to be a 4-inch finished unit, and right on my tool it tells me for a 4-inch finished unit, I want to cut my squares and my strip 5 inches. So just 1 inch bigger than whatever my finished size is. Now, if you feel comfortable cutting your squares stacked, I could actually take my squares and stack them one on top of the other, and it doesn't matter whether it's right side up or wrong side up for this particular part of the unit, because there isn't really a right or left for that center beam. Then the next thing I'm going to do is find, let me put this white piece under here. I'm looking for this dashed line, and it says center beam trim number 1, and I've actually highlighted it in blue. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but I'm going to line up that dashed line on the side of my square, and that's going to put the 4-inch finished unit line right on the base of my square, and I'm going to make a cut. Then I'm going to just pick this up. I'm going to do this a couple of times so you can see what I'm looking for. I'm going to pick up my ruler, and I'm just going to swivel the whole ruler till I get this diagonal line lined up with the line I just cut. Now, it's kind of hard for you to see because the fabric still being there makes it hard to see, so I'm just going to move this out of the way. And I'm going to lay this back down here. I had placed the dashed line on the edge of my square, so all I have to do is swivel and line up it's a dashed dot line, and it tells me it's the center beam trim number 2 line. I'm going to line it up on the edge of my cut part of the square and get rid of that part. Now these 2 parts are not needed for this block, but you can save them. There may be other things that you want to do with those. We're not going to really deal with those today, so I'm just going to lay them aside. So there's my 2 center beams. For my side triangles, remember I said you had to have a folded strip, because when I cut my side triangles, I need a right and a left to go on the sides of my corner beam. So the way I'm going to do that is line up to the bold solid black line, and it tells me on here that's the side triangle trim number 1. And I'm just going to line that up on the cut edge. If this was a longer strip that had the selvage or whatever on it, I could just trim off straight so that I could line up on that bold solid line and make a cut. And there is a pair of side triangles for my corner beam. Then all I have to do is twist my tool until I find the second trim line. It's down at the bottom of the squared corner, and also it's connected to the side seam line placement and the side triangles trim number 2. This little short line that says second trim goes on the base of my strip. This long diagonal line goes on the cut edge of my strip, and I cut again. And I actually only need 2 pairs of side triangles. So I'm just going to lay this here so you can see. And I do take the time to separate these and lay them here where it looks like a square. It is possible they will fit. You could stitch them on this way. It will never trim properly, so you don't want to do that. That's one reason I lay it here, so I can actually see how it's going to look when I get it stitched on. So I'm going to take this to the needle, and we're going to stitch that on so you can see what that looks like. So I am going to stack my side triangles and my corner beam, my center beam. Back this up so you can see a little better. And the first thing I'm going to do is peel off one of them, so I'm only dealing with one, and I'm going to layer that on. And I actually like to stitch this one on first, the side triangle on the left. If you haven't gotten yourself into the habit of stitching from a fabric tag onto your seam, this is a really good habit to get yourself into, because if your machine tends to want to eat the tips of triangles as they feed through, this will help alleviate some of that. If you have a machine that has a single hole stitch plate, that's another trick you can use to make that less of an issue. If you have a machine that is equipped with a walking foot type mechanism, that's another thing that will help that. So I'm going to lay this here, and you can quickly see that's not the right one to go on this side. I want to flip this over, and notice I have just a little ear sticking off on the bottom here. And on the top, there's also a little overlap. And that's okay. You just kind of center those two cut edges together and stitch. You don't have to fiddle with it and fuss with it because you're going to trim it. And I'm lining up on that long diagonal edge and stitching. When I get to the end, I'm just going to grab my fabric tag and stitch off of my corner beam, and I'm going to cut those apart. Now I like to just finger press, and I'm finger pressing on this particular unit toward the side triangle, and almost always that's the direction I press. There's maybe a few times for one reason or another that I press toward the center beam, but generally I'm pressing toward this side triangle. Now I'm ready to put the second side triangle on, and I'm going to overlap again so that I have an ear sticking out at the bottom. And when I get this lined up along the edge, that corner beam tip is sticking out at the top. And they're going to overlap just a little bit, and that's okay. You're just going to stitch off of your fabric tag, and I'm aligning along the long edge of this side triangle, and I'm just stitching right along the edge. I like this unit because there's really just, they're very quick because you just have 2 seams to sew, and then you're ready to trim. Make sure when you're doing finger pressing, you're not just taking your fingernail and zipping all the way down that seam, because this is a bias edge on both sides of the fabric, and so the side of the side triangle and the side of the corner beam are both bias edges, and you can distort that really easily if you're not careful. So I'm just going to line that up and stitch off of my fabric tag onto the edge here, and I'm aligning the edge along with the edge of my foot. And hopefully you won't have to work around the camera. You'll be able to see it a little better. But I've got all my stitching done, and I'm ready to press. So I'm going to go to the overhead camera so you can see what I do next. And I'm ready to press this. Let me get the iron heated back up. I also give this just a little finger press so I don't have to work so hard with the edge of it to get it to lay down the way I want it to. And you basically let the iron do the work. Just set the iron on it while you're getting the next unit ready. Then you can do the finger pressing. And I'm just going to give it a quick little swipe with the acorn pressing solution. And it gives it that nice, crisp, flat look that I'm after. So once I get that done, I'm ready to trim. So let me move the ironing mat out of my way, and I'm going to trim using the squared corner that's opposite the side that has the angle. So a couple of things I'm looking for. First of all, if you're right-handed, you're going to point the pointy end of your corner beam up to the top right corner, and you're just going to line up those 2 long diagonal lines, and it tells me that's the seam line placement on this side and the seam line placement on this side. But you want to trim the point first. And once I get that in place, I'm just going to line up that seam line on my seams, and I'm going to trim up and over. And remember, if you're right-handed, you point your unit to the top right. If you're left-handed, simply point it to the top left and turn your tool this way so that the angled side is pointing toward you. I'm not left-handed, so I'm not going to do that. So I'm always going to be trimming up the right side and across the top. When I get the first 2 sides trimmed, then I'm going to find the 4.5-inch lines. That's the cut size, but also there's a couple of things that will help me with placement. There is a little tip right here that's going to land on the point of my unit. That should say 4 because that's my finished size. There's also these little tiny slash marks right along here, and I can make sure that those are parallel to my seams. Once I get that in place, then I'm ready to trim up the right side and across the top. If you're left-handed, you're going to trim up the left side and across the top. So there is one of my corner beam units. I'm ready to do the other one. Line up those 2 long seam line placement lines, trim up and across, and then I'm going to turn 180 degrees, put the 4.5-inch lines on my cut edges, and check to make sure the number 4 point is at the tip of my corner beam unit, and I have my 4 corner beam units that will finish at 4 inches. So the next thing we're going to do is make some sliver units. Now, I want you to notice with these units, there is a right and a left. That's going to be pretty important a little bit later. But I'm just going to peel off 2 of them and put the other 2 aside. Now, I'll tell you the mistake I made. Because you are making this into a sliver unit, which is done with the corner beam tool, and when I made the corner beam unit, I started with a strip and a square 1 inch bigger than my finished size. So the only part of this that's really a part of that tool, the corner beam tool, is this small triangle on the side. That's actually the same triangle that you see here. But I start with a half square. So here's the mistake I made. When you start with your half square, normally if you're making a 4-inch finished unit, you add 1 inch and then you trim and you've got the right size. Because I'm doing a 2-step thing with this, I'm making a half square first, then I'm adding a side triangle. I have to add 1.5 inches, not just 1 inch. So I wasn't paying attention when I did this. This only I started with a 5-inch square of blue, a 5-inch square of cream, and a 5-inch strip of red, which works great if you're wanting something smaller than a 4-inch finished unit. So in order to make this the right size, I actually need to start with a 5.5-inch square of blue and a 5.5-inch square of background. So I've redone that so you can see how this works, and I've actually already done the first step. When you're doing half squares with your Tucker trimmer, you would use your Quilter's Magic Wand. You would draw your 2 lines on, stitch on the line, and then you would cut them apart and press them. And if whatever size half square you're making, you would just add 1 inch. But remember, this is a 2-step unit because I'm doing the half square first, then I'm adding that sliver. I have to add that extra 1/2 inch to my starting squares. So I'm just going to cut these in half because I've already stitched them. I did that ahead of time. And then I'll cut this one in half. I'm already ready to press these. So let me grab my pressing mat, move it over. I think I'm going to turn it this way, make it a little bit easier. Now I'm pressing toward the blue part of my half square unit. There may be a time that you're going to press a different direction, but for this one I'm pressing it toward the side that I'm going to add the sliver to. So I'm just giving them all a finger press just to make it easier for the iron to do the work so that they'll lay the way I want them to lay. So I'm just going to give them a quick little press. And now I'm going to take 2 of these units because I want to talk about how to make sure I get that mirror image. And this is pretty important, and that's also one of the things your sliver technique sheet will explain, is how to know whether you're going to take away the left side of this half square or whether you're going to take away the right side of this half square. So I'm just going to lay them here. Normally, if I was just making a half square, I would go ahead and take my Tucker trimmer and trim now. But since this is a two-step process, you don't trim your half square. But I want to trim away part of this blue half of this square so I can add a red side triangle. And I'm going to cut away part of this blue triangle so that I can add a red side triangle. So if you look at your tool, notice the angled side. If I lay it just right on the edge, it's going to take away the part here I want to add back. All right, so this one is going to end up being this side, and I'm going to just trim away. And it even tells me for a 4-inch finished unit, I cut my strips and squares 5 inches. That is for those side triangles, not for the half square. Remember, you have to do 5.5 for that part. And I can get rid of this part because I don't need that for this project. And I'm just going to lay that right here so you can see that's where we're headed with that. Now this one, because I want to make sure I cut off this side, the easiest way to do that is flip this upside down. And I'm just going to line up that dashed line on the edge here, and I'm just going to the top of that stitching line. It doesn't line up exactly here, and that's okay because it's going to get trimmed, and I'm going to get rid of that little part. So I'm cutting a sliver away. When I flip it back over, you can see I have cut off the part that I needed to in order to add back that sliver of red. That's going to go right there. So in order to get the piece that I need, I'm actually going to cut a side triangle of red, and I need a right one and a left one. So I am going to leave my red strip folded in half. Remember, you can use whatever color you want, but because I have to have a right and a left, I'm going to keep it folded. That automatically gets me both of them when I cut once. And I'm going to the bold, solid line and make a cut. And because I have it folded back to back or face to face, it automatically gives me the orientation I need in order to make that work. See how that worked? Now, I actually need 2 sets of these. So I'm just going to pick up my tool. I'm going to twist. I'm going to move these up out of the way so you know what I'm looking at. I'm only looking at my strip, this number 2nd trim line, and the side triangle trim number 2 line. Those lines are going to line up on my cut edges and line up here, and I'm going to make a cut. And this part I don't need. I just needed 2 sets that are opposite, a right and a left. Okay, so now I'm ready to add this sliver of red to my adapted half square. So I'm going to carry this to the iron or the sewing area, and we're going to stitch that on. So I don't see any questions yet. Make sure if I have made something unclear or if you need another little bit of clarification, ask, put it in the comments, because I bet you're not the only one that's making, that has wondered. So I'm going to be adding this sliver to the side, and I'm going to flip this over, and I need to make sure I have just enough here. I don't worry too much about overlapping this because my starting squares were a little bigger than I actually have to have, but I do want to make sure that I have plenty to trim away. So I'm just going to flip this over so I can see this side, and I'm going to stitch down this long diagonal seam where I trimmed away that little bit of blue, and I cut a side triangle of red to replace it. The same thing's going to happen here. I'm going to put the blue one on top. I just find it easier to stitch that. Get that lined up. There should be a little bit of an overlap on this tip, and that's okay because you're going to trim that. You have wiggle room enough to trim that away. So we're just going to trim along or stitch along the long side. I like to stitch the center part, the corner beam, or this part of the sliver that's the half square with that on top so I can see kind of where I'm going. And we're going to stitch onto our fabric tag. That's all I have to stitch on this. And check it out. It's the sliver I'm after. Now, I like to go ahead and press this toward the sliver that I added. I'm going to do this on both sides. And I'm going to finger press it. Then we're going to take it to the overhead so you can see how that works. Oh, and Phyllis says, she said making those half square triangles a ½ inch bigger is a good reminder. And that is where I went wrong. That's why I have made such a big deal out of it, because when I was putting together the square sizes that you need for this, I went, uh-oh, this isn't working, and what did I do wrong? So I have corrected it, and what you will download for your cutting instructions will be the correct number. So I am ready to trim this, and I'm going to line up the square side of my corner beam. And what I'm after is this intersection where the two lines crisscross. That needs to land right at the tip of this blue part of my sliver. And when I get that in place, I have just enough room to trim away the top and the sides. And if I've got this in place, all of these little tips here should line up with the center seam of my half square. So I'm just kind of tweaking it till those little points all line up down that seam. That intersection makes sure that I'm saving what I need at the tip so that I don't run the risk of chopping off my point on the next seam that goes across there. So you see it's a little bit odd looking, but if you measured 1/4 inch from the side here and 1/4 inch from the side here, that's going to give you the exact point of this little blue part of your sliver. Now I'm going to put the 4.5 inch line on my cut edges. That's also going to put that little arrowhead right here on the tip, and all of these little arrows should line up across that intersection. And I can make my second cut so that I have my perfect sliver. And that automatically gives me one that leans left. And check it out. This one's going to lean right. So I'm saying that this sliver, look at the blue part, leans left. This sliver leans right. And again, I'm lining up on that intersection right there where I've got it highlighted with fuchsia and yellow. And all of those little tips right along that half square. And I'm going to trim up and over. I don't have gobs of extra there to trim away, but I don't really need it. See, that's all that I had left to trim on that side. And the more you make these, the more comfortable you'll get with it. And this, again, I've lined up on the 4.5, the 4.5, all the little arrowheads line up on the seam of the half square, and that intersection should line up right on the half square as well. And I ended up with 2 units, one that leans left, one that leans right. So when you put this together, you're going to start with whatever color you picked for the center. And I'll show you, again in just a minute, the one that has 4 units together instead of just one big block. So this one, you kind of have to play with it and get, I want to show you something. You can put this together however you want. So I could actually put those 2 units like this. That is not how the double track block looks though. It is like this. Okay, so you've got options. You don't have to put it together this way, although this is how the block looks in the picture. It was kind of based on the idea of Star Trek. That's kind of the shape of, I don't remember even what the name of that Star Trek spaceship was called, but that's kind of the shape. The Enterprise? Oh, Tony's correcting me. I couldn't remember. You'd think I would know, but I don't. So I'm going to just stick these on here. This is the one that's not the right size, but just so you can get the concept, that's how it was put together. Now, of course, if you decide you want to do it a different direction, I don't care, because that's part of playing with these Blockbuster blocks. You can put them together however you want. The idea is for you to practice making these units, so you can make the sliver units, you can make the corner beam units, you could even put 4 patches here. You don't have to use just plain blocks, but that gives you an idea of what you can do with the double track block. Now, what you're going to download is the instructions for what to cut from me, and then from Studio 180 Design, that double track block with pictures and information like that. Oh, here's that alternate project. So on that one, I actually, instead of having 2 white squares for the corners, I had blue and red squares for the corners and that gold square for the center, and I made 4 6-inch finished blocks. So each unit is a 2-inch finished unit. And you can do that. You just have to change the size blocks that you start with. Okay, so Kim said, do you have any tips for storing the quilts we make? Okay, tell me more, Kim. Do you mean finished quilts or blocks until you get them put together? She thinks you're saying finished quilts. So there's all kinds of things you can do to store a finished quilt, not just for this project, but if you're making quilts and you don't know exactly where to store them, there's all kinds of options. One is you can put several quilts on a bed that's not used all the time, and you can just lay them out on the bed, one over on top of the other. That's a good way to store quilts. If you regularly fold quilts and put them in things, you don't want to put them in paper unless it's like acid-free paper. Boxes are not always a good choice, but a pillowcase will help protect it. Even if you put it like in a, what do they call it? Hope chest. Often they're pine. You want to make sure you protect the fabric from touching the wood. So that's an option. So if you're talking about what do you do with the blocks, there are storage boxes that you can get to hold the blocks until you get enough to make a quilt. Now keep in mind, if we continue this, and it's my intention to do a block each week, there are 76 Blockbuster patterns. I told Deb that's just too many for me to keep up with. But I will tell you, we're actually not going to do all of them because I've chosen to only do the fundamental tools. So I'm not doing any of the rapid fire tools. There are some Blockbuster patterns that use like the Wedge Star tool or the Lemoyne Star tool or the Hunter Star tool. I have chosen to leave those out of this Blockbuster Bash series. So you can make 12 blocks and say, I'm finished making Blockbuster blocks, or you can make all, however many it is, it's not 76, but you can make all of the blocks and put them all together or have several quilts. And I chose to do red, white, and blue for all of mine. And then our local guild has a Quilt of Honor and Quilt of Valor project. So these will be put together in Quilts of Honor at some point. The other thing you can do is if you find a block that you just love that block, say for instance, this is the block you just love, there's nothing that says you can't make 12 of this one block and just repeat that block in your quilt. Or pick out 2 blocks and just make half and half and alternate them. That makes a really interesting project. So you have lots of options for what you can do. So when we are doing these blocks, I am doing them in order, but I am skipping some. And in my memory, I can tell you real quick what the next number will be. Next one is number 13, but there are some that I'm skipping. Not only the rapid fire tools, but any block that is not a multiple of 12. That means like if it's a block that finishes 10 inches, 14 inches, 15 inches, that's not easily divisible into 12, I'm skipping that block. They're fun blocks to make, but it's just easier to stick with one size that we can either make into a 9-patch, a 4-patch, a 16-patch, or I have to think about this, 6 times 6, a 36-patch. So that's kind of where I'm headed. So next week, hopefully everybody could hear the whole time today. Like I said, I reset everything. And as I sat down to set up the video tonight, Facebook has made changes. So it just doesn't always work the same. So I'm not the only crazy one, although part of the time it is operator error, but not always. But we appreciate you joining us. Feel free to contact us if you have questions. If you don't get the emails that have the links to the cutting instructions and the blocks that I'm demonstrating each month, let me know and I'll add you to our group. And you can also watch these videos on YouTube. After they air on Facebook, then I transfer them to YouTube and you can watch them there. And contact us for the tools you need and the technique sheets you need. So we'll see you next week, live at 5 for block number 13. And the name of that block is called She Bear. Think bear claws. So see you next week. Happy sewing.